Sam is the hero next door. Driving down the busy street, greeting people that he meets. Someone could be in a jam, so hurry, hurry, Fireman Sam. He's always on the scene, Fireman Sam, and his engine's bright and clean. Fireman Sam, you cannot ignore. Sam is the hero next door.
It's blowing a gale today in Pontypandy, but a hurricane wouldn't lower the spirits of the ever-cheerful, debonair Trevor Evans, the bus. Oh! Fireman Sam's just finishing his breakfast.
High winds this morning in South Wales, but moderating later in the day. Gale warnings in force.
I quite like windy days. Wind blows those cobwebs away. I know. I think I'll give Sarah and James a ring. Perhaps we could go to the park after I finish my shift. Odd. That's very odd. The phone's dead. Pronto, pronto. Hello, hello. Oh, il telefono in on work. Hello there, Bella. I'll have my usual. Cheese and chutney sandwiches, please. Sandwiches. How make the sandwiches? I got no bread. I phoned the baker, but the phone no work. Oh, mamma mia. Leave it to me, Bella. I'll see what I can do. Hello, Sarah. James. Oh, Mr. Evans, can you drop us off at the park, please? Hop in, then. Oh, that's a nice kite you got there. I'll show you how to fly it. But we know, Mr. Evans. Not as well as me, my sugar lumps.
Make me some tea, make me some tea, make me a lovely cup of tea. You got any plans today, Sam?
Not very easy to make plans, Elvis. The phones are dead.
Dead? Oh, that's sad, man.
Oh, Darrow. Now who needs the fire service? Get to work, man. Telegraph pole down on the Newtown Road. All present and correct, sir. Right, let's go. Oh, steady on.
Uncle Sam's in a hurry today.
Here we are, sir. Here's the cause of the trouble. Yes, here is the cause of the trouble. Trouble? It's not on fire. Yes, we know. But it's a danger to traffic. Oh, yes. Dilys Price wants to get Mummy's little Norman from under her feet.
I want to watch the telly.
That's all you ever do. You'll have square eyes, my sweet.
Oh, Mum.
Now then, off you go to have a lovely play in the park. Norman! Scram! Whee! Now then, you hold the kite like so. Keep the string tight, arm's length. Oh, it snapped. Now don't worry, it'll be up in no time. Oh, no, hang on a minute. Oh, no, come back here. No, come to Trevor. Oh. Yes, well.
Oh, Mr. Evans, look out!
Sorry, Mr. Evans. It's quite all right, Norman. All systems go, Cridlington.
Yeah, go, man, go. I mean, all systems go, sir.
Right, Fireman Sam, reverse mode.
Yes, sir.
Come on, Jupiter. Back a bit. Back. Yeah, no, that'll do. Okay, man, make up. Another job well done. There. We leave the rest to the telephone engineers.
Well, I don't know what the world's coming to. No telephone now. Mamma mia! Che cosa? Oh, do you have to be so dramatic? Oh! Well, I never!
I'll just tell Bella that the telephone problem's in hand, sir.
Quite right, Fireman Sam.
Well, that's it, ladies. We done our bit. Oh, what's that kite doing on your roof, dearest?
Nothing to do with me, Sam. I don't know. He just fly there now.
Looks like Sarah and James's. Well, we'll get it down this time as a special favour.
Don't you fall, mind? Ah, bellissimo. You worry about our Sam. No, my apples. Oh.
Mind yourselves, ladies. Yes, ladder coming through. Extend. Well, into the building.
You worry about your apples. What if he fall?
I won't fall, Bella. I've done this 1,000 times, I have. Right, here we are. Well, it won't be long now. Right there.
Oh.
Steady, sir.
Careful!
Right. There. Got it.
Hooray!
Good for you, Fireman Sam.
Hooray!
Bravo! Oh, yes, he's so brave.
There we are.
I hope you didn't break anything up there. And you tell Sarah and James to look after things in future, mind. Norman, now, he's never lost anything.
Yes, all right, dearie.
Uncle Sam, come quickly. It's Mr. Evans. He's hurt his arm and lost our kite.
Yes, I can see the problem. Bandages.
Oh, bandages.
Not to worry. Nothing too serious, eh? That arm will be fine in no time at all.
I'm not surprised. It's the other one that hurts.
I don't think you'd better drive home with 2 bad arms, Trevor.
Sorry about the kite, kids.
Oh, it's all right, Mr. Evans. Huh. I wonder where it's got to, though.
Well, now, take a look over there.
Oh, thanks a lot, Uncle Sam.